The most dangerous wars are not fought with weapons, nor declared with banners or armies. They unfold silently, deep within the psyche, where thoughts, fears, insecurities, and desires collide. Before any betrayal is spoken aloud, before anyone turns against another, there is an invisible conflict brewing beneath the surface. This unseen war begins in the subtle and often chaotic landscape of the human mind, where the conscious and unconscious are constantly negotiating for dominance. People often assume that betrayal happens suddenly as a reaction to an external event, but in truth, it starts much earlier, long before any visible action is taken. It begins in the private, unspoken spaces of perception and interpretation. Every human being carries unresolved emotional residues, experiences that were never fully processed, truths that were too painful to face, and insecurities that linger like echoes. These fragments do not disappear with time. They sink into the unconscious and wait for moments to be triggered. When someone encounters a person who unknowingly reflects these buried fragments, something is set in motion. Without realizing it, they begin to experience an inner discomfort, a sense of threat that has little to do with the other person's actual behavior and everything to do with their own inner landscape. The psyche senses this mirroring and reacts defensively, often through mechanisms that are subtle but powerful. The war begins as a whisper, a fleeting thought that someone is too confident, too different, too challenging. These thoughts often seem insignificant at first, but they are sparks that can ignite psychological fires. The conscious mind tries to rationalize them, perhaps by finding faults, exaggerating flaws, or attaching meaning to neutral actions. Meanwhile, the unconscious is working behind the scenes, shaping perceptions and intensifying emotional reactions. This is where misunderstandings, jealousy, and resentment take root, not because of objective wrongdoing, but because of the internal tensions that have been stirred. Perception becomes distorted as the inner conflict grows. What was once neutral behavior starts to look suspicious. Words are interpreted through the lens of personal wounds. Someone's success might unconsciously remind another of their own failures. Someone's calmness might highlight another's inner chaos. These psychological contrasts can create a sense of discomfort that is difficult to name. Instead of recognizing it as an internal reaction, the mind projects it outward, creating stories to justify the unease. They think they're better than me. They're being fake. Something about them isn't right. These are not objective observations. They are defenses meant to protect the ego from facing deeper truths. This unseen war is not always malicious, but it is always impactful. Even the kindest people carry shadows, and when those shadows are stirred, their behavior begins to shift, often without their awareness. Body language changes first, subtle withdrawals, less warmth in interactions, slightly longer silences. Thoughts begin to loop, conversations replay in the mind, doubts multiply. Over time, these inner battles shape outer actions. A slight coldness turns into avoidance. A quiet judgment grows into a firm narrative. And slowly, what started as an invisible psychological conflict evolves into visible distance or betrayal. The most striking aspect of this inner war is that it often has little to do with the person who becomes the target. They may have done nothing wrong. In fact, they might have done something right, spoken truthfully, embodied confidence, or remained authentic. But authenticity often acts as a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable for those who are not ready to see themselves clearly. When someone's presence reflects another person's hidden fears or unresolved pain, the unconscious may perceive it as a threat. It responds with defense mechanisms like projection, rationalization, or withdrawal, not out of hatred, but out of psychological self-preservation. Cultural conditioning adds another layer to this war. Many societies discourage emotional honesty and self-reflection, teaching people to maintain appearances rather than confront their inner struggles. This makes the unconscious conflicts even more potent because they are rarely acknowledged or processed. People are taught to interpret their discomfort as evidence of the other person's flaws rather than signals of their own inner turmoil. This lack of introspection allows the unseen war to grow unchecked, shaping opinions, behaviors, and alliances without anyone consciously realizing it. Relationships, whether personal, social, or professional, are often shaped more by these unconscious dynamics than by rational choices. A person might decide to distance themselves, criticize, or even turn against someone not because of any real harm done, but because that person unknowingly became a stage for their unresolved psychological battles. It is easier to externalize than to introspect. It is easier to point fingers than to face the parts of oneself that have been buried in shadow. And so the inner war expands outward, quietly influencing how people speak, act, and connect. This war is unseen, but its consequences are tangible. It can fracture friendships, corrode trust, and create silent divisions. It thrives in environments where communication is shallow and self-awareness is scarce. Because it begins within the psyche, it often cannot be stopped by external logic or confrontation. To understand it, one must look beneath the surface of behavior and into the hidden architecture of human emotion and perception. Only there can the real origins of betrayal, resentment, and hostility be traced back to the quiet battleground where they were born, before hostility becomes visible, before words are twisted and loyalties fracture. Something more subtle takes place. The mind begins to project. Projection is one of the psyche's oldest defense mechanisms, a way of disowning inner truths by casting them outward onto others. It happens quietly and often unconsciously, but its effects are profound. The moment projection begins, perception is no longer clear. Reality bends to fit the contours of one's unresolved fears, insecurities, and hidden desires. In this way, projections become the first weapons in the silent psychological wars that turn people against each other. Every individual carries traits they are uncomfortable accepting about themselves. These may include impulses that contradict their self-image, emotions they've been taught to suppress, or flaws they fear being judged for. Instead of confronting these parts directly, the psyche often pushes them into the unconscious, hiding them in the shadow. But the shadow never disappears. It waits for opportunities to reveal itself indirectly. When someone else enters the picture, someone who embodies, triggers, or even vaguely resembles these hidden aspects, the unconscious finds its target. Suddenly, the traits that a person cannot acknowledge in themselves are perceived in another. The mind shifts blame, discomfort, or judgment outward, creating a psychological shield that preserves the ego's fragile image. This process often begins subtly. A person might meet someone confident and immediately feel that they are arrogant. Another might see kindness and interpret it as weakness. Someone might observe emotional control and label it as coldness. These interpretations are rarely objective. They are colored by the projector's internal world. A person who secretly fears their own arrogance may accuse others of being prideful. Someone who struggles with vulnerability might mock others for being too emotional. In each case, projection functions as both a mirror and a weapon. It reflects what lies within, while simultaneously deflecting it away from the self through judgment or accusation. What makes projection such a potent psychological weapon is that it distorts reality while feeling entirely accurate to the person projecting. Because the emotions involved are genuine, the conclusions feel justified. The mind doesn't consciously say, "This is about me." Instead, it says, "I see this in you," and believes it. The projection becomes a lens through which all future interactions are filtered. Every word, gesture, or silence is reinterpreted to confirm the projected narrative. Over time, this creates a version of the other person that exists more in the projector's psyche than in objective reality. Projections also reveal themselves in emotional intensity. When someone reacts with disproportionate anger, suspicion, or disdain toward traits that are relatively neutral, it is often because those traits touch something raw within them. The reaction is not to the external trigger alone, but to the internal material the trigger awakens. For example, if a person has repressed envy, encountering someone successful can provoke not admiration, but irritation or criticism. They may convince themselves that the other person achieved their success unfairly or that it is superficial. In truth, the reaction stems from their own unacknowledged longing and frustration. Projection transforms internal conflict into external judgment, making it easier to attack the enemy outside than face the discomfort inside. In groups, projections can spread quickly, acting like psychological contagions. One person's distorted perception can influence others, especially if those others share similar insecurities or unresolved wounds. A simple comment like, "I don't trust them, they're too ambitious," can plant seeds of suspicion in minds that are already fertile with similar feelings. When multiple people project onto the same individual, their combined narratives can create a powerful and convincing illusion. The target becomes a symbol onto which the group deposits their collective shadows. This is why groups sometimes turn against someone suddenly and unanimously, even when no real offense has occurred. The projections unite them more effectively than facts ever could. In personal relationships, projection can quietly erode trust. One partner may accuse the other of intentions they do not have, interpreting neutral actions through the lens of fear or past experiences. A friend may distance themselves, convinced that the other harbors ill feelings, when in fact those feelings belong to themselves. These situations often escalate because projections are defended fiercely. To challenge someone's projection is to threaten the protective wall around their ego. As a result, the person projecting may double down, finding more evidence to support their distorted perception. What began as an unconscious defense slowly becomes a conscious conviction. Further deepening the divide, projection also plays a significant role in betrayal because it allows individuals to morally justify turning against someone. Once the other person has been cast as arrogant, untrustworthy, or harmful, regardless of the truth, it becomes easier to act in ways that align with this narrative. Gossip, coldness, or betrayal can then feel like justified responses rather than moral breaches. The unconscious fear or discomfort that triggered the projection in the first place is transformed into a story where the other person becomes the antagonist. This self-created drama is convincing enough that the projector rarely questions it. Psychological projection thrives in environments where self-awareness is low and emotional honesty is avoided. Without reflection, people are quick to believe that their perceptions are objective truths rather than subjective interpretations. Modern culture often encourages this by rewarding quick judgments and superficial narratives over deeper self-inquiry. People learn to trust their immediate impressions even when those impressions are shaped by inner conflicts. As a result, projections become default weapons, fast, invisible, and effective. They allow individuals to protect their egos while appearing morally justified, and they can spread through social circles with alarming speed. The tragedy of projection is that it prevents genuine understanding. Instead of seeing others as they are, people see them through the fog of their own unconscious material. Instead of communicating openly, they act based on assumptions. Instead of recognizing their own fears and desires, they wage psychological battles against externalized versions of themselves. And in doing so, they set in motion the first silent acts of betrayal, not through deliberate malice, but through the deeply human tendency to avoid looking inward. Silence is often mistaken for peace, but in the realm of human relationships, silence can be a fertile ground for misunderstanding. When genuine dialogue is absent, the mind does not rest in stillness, it begins to weave narratives. These narratives are not neutral. They are shaped by fears, insecurities, assumptions, and fragments of past experiences. Silence does not bring clarity, it creates space for interpretation, and interpretation, when left unchecked, rarely leads to truth. Instead, silence breeds stories, not understanding, and those stories become powerful forces that can alter perceptions and relationships. Without a single word being spoken, every human being is wired to make sense of their environment. When information is missing, the mind instinctively fills the gaps. This is a survival mechanism developed to protect against uncertainty. But in interpersonal dynamics, this mechanism often leads to distorted conclusions. A moment of unreturned communication, an unexplained shift in behavior, or a subtle change in tone can trigger an avalanche of speculation. The silence becomes a canvas, and the mind begins to paint it with the colors of its own emotional history. People project their expectations, fears, and memories onto that blank space, creating narratives that feel real. Because they are emotionally charged, these stories often take shape gradually. It might start with a single thought: they didn't respond to me. If that thought remains unchallenged, it quickly evolves into a theory: maybe they're upset. Soon it becomes a conclusion: they must be angry with me. Each stage of this progression adds emotional weight, making the story feel more certain, even though no real evidence supports it. The longer the silence persists, the more elaborate the story becomes. The mind searches for patterns to confirm the emerging narrative, recalling past incidents or small details that seem to align with the assumption. Before long, a simple absence of communication has transformed into a fully formed belief about another person's intentions or feelings. This process is amplified by unresolved insecurities. If someone fears abandonment, silence might be interpreted as rejection. If someone struggles with guilt, they may assume they have done something wrong. If someone carries past wounds of betrayal, they might see silence as a prelude to deception. These interpretations are not objective reflections of reality, but mirrors of the inner emotional landscape. The silence itself is neutral, but the story it gives birth to is shaped by what already lives inside the interpreter. In this way, silence acts like a psychological mirror, reflecting back the contents of one's unconscious rather than revealing the truth about others. In relationships, this dynamic can quietly corrode trust. Instead of seeking clarification through open conversation, people often retreat further into their assumptions. Two individuals may experience the same silence, but construct entirely different stories around it. One may interpret it as distance, the other as respect for space. One may see it as passive aggression, the other as emotional fatigue. Without communication, these differing narratives remain unspoken, allowing misunderstandings to multiply. The absence of shared reality becomes a breeding ground for emotional distance, as each person relates more to their internal story than to the actual other person. Silence also invites the ego to protect itself. When faced with uncertainty, the ego prefers control over vulnerability. Crafting a story provides a sense of control. It turns ambiguity into something seemingly concrete. Even if the story is negative, it feels safer to believe in a narrative than to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. This is why people often choose suspicion over patience, blame over curiosity. The stories created in silence give them a psychological anchor, even if that anchor drags the relationship into unnecessary conflict. Groups and communities are not immune to this phenomenon. In social settings, when someone withdraws or remains silent, others often create collective stories to explain it. Gossip thrives in these spaces because silence leaves room for speculation, and speculation shared among multiple people can quickly harden into collective belief. A single unanswered question can spiral into a rumor as each participant adds their own interpretation. What began as one person's inner story becomes a shared narrative that influences group dynamics, alliances, and judgments. The silence of one individual can inadvertently trigger the storytelling instincts of many, shaping perceptions far beyond their control. Technology amplifies this effect. In digital communication, where tone and facial expressions are absent, silence becomes even more ambiguous. A seen but unreplied message, a delayed response, or a vague post can send minds into overdrive. People check timestamps, reread messages, and analyze digital silence as though it contains hidden codes. These interpretations are often driven by emotional states rather than facts, but once the story is formed, it influences future interactions. Trust can erode not because of actual betrayal, but because silence was interpreted through the lens of fear or insecurity. The stories bred by silence are sticky. Once the mind has committed to a particular interpretation, it becomes resistant to contradictory information. This is due to a cognitive bias called confirmation bias, where people selectively notice details that support their existing beliefs and ignore those that challenge them. So even if the silence is eventually broken and clarification is offered, the original story may linger in the background, shaping future perceptions. People may say they understand the explanation, but emotionally, the story they created has already left its mark. These silent stories are especially dangerous because they feel private and harmless, but they are not. They shape emotional responses, behaviors, and decisions. They can lead to withdrawal, resentment, passive aggression, or even preemptive betrayal. A person who believes their friend is angry based on silence alone, might start acting defensively, which in turn triggers genuine distance. A colleague who interprets a superior's silence as disapproval may begin overcompensating or withdrawing, inadvertently creating tension where none existed. In this way, silence becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the story created in the mind begins to manifest in real interactions. The longer silence persists, the stronger these stories become. They gain emotional depth and narrative complexity, becoming difficult to disentangle from reality. People rarely pause to question their assumptions once they have emotionally invested in them. Instead, they act as if their interpretation is fact, which can lead to decisions and actions that create actual misunderstandings, even betrayals that were never present in the first place. Silence gives the unconscious mind room to speak loudly, and what it says is often shaped more by the past than by the present moment. The shadow does not only shape individual behavior, it also weaves silent threads between people, forming alliances that are rarely spoken but deeply felt. These alliances are not forged through deliberate agreements or logical discussions. They emerge unconsciously as the hidden insecurities, fears, and unresolved wounds within individuals resonate with one another. The shadow recognizes itself in others long before the conscious mind does. When several people carry similar unacknowledged feelings, their shadows align, creating a psychological bond that can unite them against a shared target or idea without any explicit coordination. These invisible alliances are subtle but powerful, capable of shifting group dynamics, influencing perceptions, and turning quiet tensions into collective betrayals. At the heart of these alliances is emotional resonance. Every individual carries a unique constellation of shadow elements, traits, impulses, and memories they have suppressed or denied. When two people share similar unresolved emotional material, they intuitively sense it in one another. It might be envy, inadequacy, resentment, shame, or fear. These shared emotional undercurrents generate a kind of unspoken familiarity, a feeling of they understand me, without either party being fully aware of why. It is not necessarily empathy that binds them, but a mutual avoidance of the same uncomfortable truths. Their alliance is built not on shared ideals, but on shared psychological blind spots. This phenomenon becomes especially visible in social groups. Imagine a workplace where one person's confidence and authenticity unconsciously trigger feelings of insecurity in several colleagues. Each of those individuals experiences their discomfort privately at first. They might tell themselves that the person is arrogant or difficult, constructing personal narratives to explain their feelings. But as they interact with one another, they begin to pick up on similar sentiments. A passing comment, a knowing look, or a subtle tone of disapproval can reveal that others feel the same discomfort. Without any formal discussion, an unspoken alliance begins to take shape. Their shared shadow elements create a collective story. The confident person becomes the outsider, the problem, the one who must be subtly resisted or undermined. These alliances thrive in ambiguity. Because they are formed unconsciously, they rarely need to be articulated. A simple remark can act as a signal, and those who share the same hidden tensions respond instinctively. The alliance is felt in the way people exchange glances during meetings, in the way gossip circulates without needing clear evidence, in the way support is withheld or loyalties quietly shift. The shadow forms these bonds beneath the level of awareness, allowing people to feel united while avoiding the discomfort of examining their own psychological contributions to the tension. It is easier to stand together against a perceived external problem than to face the mirror of shared insecurity. What makes these alliances powerful is that they often masquerade as moral or rational positions. People believe they are united by shared values or legitimate concerns, when in reality they are united by their shadows. For example, a group may justify their growing disdain for someone by claiming that person is too dominant, too different, or too challenging. But beneath those reasons lie personal insecurities that have never been acknowledged. These alliances gain strength because they provide psychological relief. By externalizing their discomfort onto someone else, individuals avoid the difficult task of self-reflection. The alliance gives their inner conflict a collective voice, which feels validating and righteous. These shadow-based alliances can emerge in families, workplaces, friend groups, or even entire communities. In families, for instance, siblings might form a subtle bond against one member who embodies qualities that unsettle the family's unspoken dynamics. In workplaces, employees might unite against a particularly ambitious or authentic colleague whose presence highlights their own complacency or hidden envy. In social groups, individuals who share similar emotional wounds can align against an outsider who inadvertently disrupts the group's unspoken equilibrium. These alliances are not inherently evil or intentional. They are psychological strategies for managing discomfort. Yet their consequences can be serious, as they shape behaviors, attitudes, and decisions in ways that are neither fully conscious nor fair. The alliances formed by shadows are often sustained by projection. When people unite through shared insecurities, they tend to project those insecurities onto the same target. One person's discomfort becomes the group's collective judgment. This projection gives the alliance a sense of coherence. It seems as though everyone is reacting to objective flaws in the target, when in reality, they are reacting to similar internal struggles reflected by that target. As the projections overlap, they create a convincing narrative that feels factual. This shared story becomes the glue of the alliance, allowing individuals to reinforce each other's distorted perceptions without recognizing them as such. Nonverbal communication plays a crucial role in maintaining these invisible bonds. A slight nod, a sigh, a strategically timed silence can signal agreement and strengthen the alliance. People within these groups often do not need explicit discussions. Their shared emotional undercurrents are enough to sustain a silent understanding. This is why such alliances can feel so difficult to confront or disrupt. There are no official agreements to challenge, no concrete accusations to address. The alliance exists in the realm of implication, intuition, and shared shadow material. Making it both elusive and powerful, these alliances often escalate without anyone realizing it. What begins as subtle shared discomfort can grow into coordinated behaviors, exclusion, gossip, passive resistance, or open criticism. As individuals within the alliance interact, their shared narratives become more elaborate and emotionally charged. Each person contributes their own interpretation, and together they build a collective psychological framework that justifies their stance. The target of this alliance may start to feel an intangible shift in the atmosphere long before any clear hostility emerges. Rooms grow colder, interactions feel strained, and trust slowly erodes. Even though no direct confrontation has occurred, technology and social media have amplified this dynamic. Online spaces allow shadows to find resonance more quickly and at larger scales. People with similar insecurities or grievances can find each other and form digital alliances through likes, comments, and shared narratives. A vague post or a subtle complaint can attract others who feel the same way, and together they create echo chambers that magnify their shared projections. These virtual alliances are often even more invisible than in-person ones because the cues are fragmented and dispersed, yet their psychological impact can be immense. Shadow alliances are difficult to detect because they operate beneath rational awareness, both for those who form them and for those who are affected by them. Individuals may genuinely believe their alliances are based on shared principles, unaware that it is their unexamined fears and insecurities that have drawn them together. The target of these alliances may struggle to understand the sudden collective shift, sensing that something unspoken is occurring but unable to trace its origins in direct conversation. This ambiguity gives shadow alliances their enduring power, allowing them to shape relationships, group dynamics, and even entire social structures without ever needing to be named. Betrayal carries a peculiar kind of clarity. While words can disguise, decorate, or distort reality, betrayal has a way of stripping away the performances people construct. It exposes the underlying truths that polite conversation, social masks, and even sincere intentions often conceal. When someone turns away, acts against you, or withdraws their loyalty in silence, their behavior becomes a kind of unfiltered language. It is raw, unspoken, and often more revealing than anything they could have articulated. Betrayal reveals what words conceal, not because it is noble or intentional, but because it emerges from deeper psychological forces that language often tries to control. Human communication is layered. On the surface are words, the narratives people choose to share, the explanations they craft, the images they build of themselves. Beneath those words are emotions, fears, and desires that are not always acknowledged or understood. Words can be deliberate, shaped to project a certain image or to maintain harmony. People often say what is expected, not what is true. They promise loyalty they are not certain they can uphold. They offer kindness while harboring quiet resentment. They speak diplomatically to preserve relationships, even when the relationship is already cracking beneath the surface. Words can be sincere but incomplete, honest but selective, clear but strategically limited. Betrayal bypasses this entire layer of controlled expression. It does not need language to communicate its message. It appears in actions, in choices made when no one is watching, in the sudden shift of behavior that cannot be explained away by polite excuses. A friend who distances themselves without confrontation, a colleague who undermines you in silence, a loved one who withdraws their support when challenges arise. These betrayals speak volumes without uttering a word. They reveal where loyalty was conditional, where admiration was mixed with envy, where connection was more fragile than appearances suggested. The reason betrayal is so revealing lies in the way it originates. Words are filtered through the conscious mind, shaped by social expectations and personal intentions. Betrayal, however, often emerges from unconscious motivations. It is the point where hidden insecurities, resentments, and desires break through the surface. Someone may never admit to their envy, but betrayal shows it. They may never voice their growing disconnection, but their actions eventually express it. They may maintain an image of loyalty for years, but when circumstances test that loyalty, their choices reveal their true priorities. In this sense, betrayal functions like a psychological X-ray, exposing structures beneath the surface that were previously invisible. This exposure often comes suddenly, which is why betrayal feels so shocking. People tend to trust the words they hear and the roles others play. They build expectations around shared narratives, believing that what has been spoken reflects what is real. But betrayal interrupts these narratives abruptly. It introduces a new, undeniable piece of information, a behavior that contradicts the spoken story. This contradiction forces a reevaluation of everything that came before. The things that were once dismissed as insignificant, hesitations, subtle changes in tone, unexplained silences, suddenly gain new meaning in the light of betrayal. It is as if scattered puzzle pieces finally form a picture that was there all along, but no one wanted to see. Betrayal also reveals the emotional architecture of relationships. In many connections, people maintain a balance through mutual performances, unspoken agreements, or shared illusions. They may avoid certain topics, suppress certain feelings, or accept dynamics that are not entirely healthy simply to preserve stability. But betrayal disrupts this balance. When someone betrays, their action often reflects the emotions and thoughts that have been simmering beneath the surface, unaddressed. The mask drops and the underlying structure of the relationship is exposed. Sometimes the betrayal reveals cracks that were always present but ignored. Other times it exposes the gradual erosion of trust that words had attempted to cover with reassurances. The psychological discomfort that betrayal brings stems from this collision between appearance and reality. The betrayed person must confront the fact that the narratives they trusted were incomplete or even false. They are forced to acknowledge the existence of layers in the relationship that they did not see or refused to see. Betrayal reveals not only the betrayer's hidden truths, but also the blind spots of the betrayed. It shines light on what both sides avoided acknowledging, often for different reasons. For the betrayer, it may have been shame or fear of confrontation. For the betrayed, it may have been a desire for certainty or emotional security. The revealing power of betrayal extends beyond personal relationships. In social groups, workplaces, or communities, betrayal often exposes hidden alliances, silent competitions, and suppressed tensions. A sudden act of disloyalty can uncover a network of quiet agreements and shared resentments that had been operating in the background. It shows how appearances of unity can mask underlying fractures, how collective narratives can conceal individual ambitions, and how social harmony can rest on fragile foundations of unspoken discontent. When betrayal happens in these contexts, it functions almost like a spotlight, illuminating everything that had been operating in shadow. Betrayal can also reveal the true nature of values and priorities. People may claim to hold certain principles, but betrayal shows what they will choose when those principles are tested. Someone who speaks about loyalty may abandon it when their self-interest is threatened. Someone who preaches fairness may act unjustly when envy takes hold. Someone who claims closeness may disappear when vulnerability is required. In this way, betrayal is not just a personal act, it is a revelation of character, stripping away the stories people tell about themselves and exposing the deeper forces that guide their actions when they are no longer performing. In psychological terms, betrayal often emerges when the pressure between the conscious self-image and the unconscious shadow becomes too great to contain. The conscious mind tries to maintain harmony, but the shadow carries impulses, fears, and desires that cannot be indefinitely suppressed. When circumstances trigger those hidden elements, they erupt into behavior that contradicts the persona someone has carefully constructed. The betrayal is not always planned. Sometimes it is simply the moment when the inner truth breaks through the outer mask. This is why betrayal can feel both personal and impersonal at the same time. It is directed toward someone, but it originates from forces deeper than deliberate choice, because betrayal reveals through action. It often communicates more accurately than speech. People can lie with words, but their behavior under pressure tends to disclose their authentic emotional positions. This is why betrayal, despite its pain, carries undeniable truth. It is a moment when reality asserts itself against illusion, when the hidden becomes visible not through confession, but through choice. And once revealed, those truths cannot be fully covered again by explanations or apologies, because the behavior itself has already spoken in a language more powerful than words